Welcome to the Code with Jason meetup. We have some live coding that I wanted to do today as usual, but I wanted to bring up some other stuff first just because me and James and Steven were talking about it before I hit record. Um, so recently I had on my podcast, the Code with Jason podcast, a very distinguished guest, a gentleman named Dave Thomas, who you might know as the co-author of the book The Pragmatic Programmer, which has been a very influential book in the world of programming. Um, and I didn't expect this, but me and Dave got into a friendly debate about whether there exists one objective reality or not. Um, I'm of the belief that there is. Dave was of the belief that there's not. Um, anyway, this stirred up some thoughts for me that I've been having recently because I think the reason that me and Dave were talking about that stuff on the podcast is because I was trying to lay a solid foundation that everybody agrees on and build up from there. I didn't expect that. I thought it would be a solid foundation that everybody agrees on, but it's not something everybody agrees on. Um, but I've seen a lot of really bad programming advice in my career, and I've seen a lot of like really regrettable trends and fashions and stuff like that. Um, and what you might call bad philosophy, um, which is like um, flawed ways of flawed ways of thinking, I guess. One of which is the idea that in programming, it's all subjective and everybody's ideas are equally valid. Or like any way of doing something is just as good as any other way. Like if it works for you, do it. And like on one hand, I can kind of see the if it works for you, do it kind of thing, but I don't think that it should be let off the hook that easy. Um, and there's some certain questions that I pose to myself, like in programming, what exactly is objective and what's subjective, and how do we know the difference? Um, for example, Um, there's a popular guideline that short functions are better than long functions because small things tend to be easier to understand than long things. I think that's kind of objectively true. Like it's really hard to make the argument that big things are easier to understand than small things. And there's other things in programming that are much more subjective, like some people like Ruby, some people like Python. You're entitled to your opinion. It's hard to imagine how we could objectively say that one language is better than another language or something like that. I take that back, actually. PHP sucks as a language.
Yeah, I don't know about that, but you bring up a lot of things, and I think in listening to you and Dave talk this through, I kind of came out on a little bit more on your side on a theoretical basis that there is a fundamental truth uh, or objective truth, but and to borrow a phrase from Dave Thomas, maybe Dave's stance is more pragmatic
Hmm.
in the sense of sometimes you may not be able to divine what the objective truth is because it might be hard to measure. I've definitely seen a lot of these, as you call them, fashions in computer science be put out there without a whole lot of evidence. And a lot of people go on to it. And when you sit down there and try to say, well, what's the evidence that this really works? And how do we measure it? How do we say how much it really works? Like your example that you gave, I think is a good one about short things are easier to understand than long things. Uh, on its face, yeah, it sounds totally makes sense. But then where do you draw the line? Like in my linter, what do I make a warning or even an error if, like in Rubocop, what is Rubocop has by default, I think 10 lines per method. Do I fail my build if my method gets more than 10 lines? And I have to explicitly go in and say it's an exception for whatever reason and have that discussion with my team. I don't know. That's hard to say. Is 8 lines the right way? I think even Bob Martin had a smaller limit, like maybe 6 lines, if I remember right.
Mhm.
Uh, and same with Sandy Metz. But I mean, to me, I find that hard to live with. And 10 I find to be a kind of a challenge too a lot of the times. And I find myself making methods what I think is worse to understand in order to fit in that. But anyway, I guess the point is like uh, at some point you're just going to have to make a decision for yourself or for your team and say, well, let's do this, even though we don't
Well,
know exactly what the right answer is.
yeah,
We think it's in the right direction. Let's see what happens. And I think that's where uh, if I had to guess what I know about Dave Thomas, and he'll probably correct me,
hmm,
but that's the kind of pragmatic approach that, or agile approach that he would uh,
yeah. Well,
agree with.
I think we have to be careful not to conflate two distinct matters. Um, One is like the idea that small functions are easier to understand than big functions, and then the separate question is where do you draw the line exactly?
I
Um,
agree that those are two separate things, but the problem is like how else do you where do you draw the line? Like if you're gonna say that that's an important thing for us to enforce or at least have a warning about, then where do you draw the line? Right.
I
And I,
mean, like, does that line even matter? I guess it's the follow-up question to that because going back to like Sandy Metz and stuff, she advocates for scoring functions on like a flog score, but even then, there's like a gray area in between where even something that would be a little bit higher than, the recommended like below 10 could be justifiable in like some contexts, you know?
right. Here's where I want to get to is is um small functions are easier to understand than big ones. That's objective. The exact number of lines that are chosen, that's subjective. But it's objectively true that that's a subjective matter. Um, and how many lines is the right number of lines? I'm not necessarily too interested in that question. Um, I'm more interested in why. Okay, I'm interested in is it objectively true that short functions are better than large ones because they're easier to understand? And if so, why? If not, why not? Um, and that kind of thing. Like making these distinctions between what's subjective and what's objective.
think of it in this terms. It's like saying having tests is better than not having tests, which you would think would be objectively true, but I've seen cases where it's just not true. Like the tests are more of a tech debt than a help. It's like a double-edged sword.
Yeah. Okay, so that's definitely true. Let me zoom out a bit. And by the way, welcome Luciano.
Luciano.
Um, so my working title for this book, which currently is about a page and a half, is software
Which you
design.
told us about. I don't think you mentioned it when you started recording.
Oh, yeah. I've started writing this book. I don't know if it'll end up being an actual book that gets published, but the working title is Software Design Theory. Um, and I start by talking about how every discipline has some amount of theory behind it. Um, and there's two kinds of theory, but there's some disciplines like brain surgery or aviation, where the theory behind it really matters. And these are like very technical life and death kind of things. Um, and then there's theory that lies behind things like photography or music. You know, those are arts. Nobody's going to die if you take a crappy photograph. Um, but just because art is subjective doesn't mean that there's not theory behind these things. Um, and there is such a thing as better and worse photographs. Different people can have different tastes and disagree on what's a good, what they like. They can disagree on what they like. Um, but some art is better than other art. And I think cooking is a good example. Like people have different tastes. Some people don't like olives, some people do, whatever. Some people might eat at the same restaurant. One person thinks it's good, another person doesn't. Um, but there's objective theory behind cooking. There's an enormous body of theory behind cooking, even though I've never heard of a book called Cooking Theory or a concept of cooking theory, but it still exists. Um, and with software design, I've never heard the words put together, software design theory. We do have some amount of theory behind software design, but it's nowhere near as like mature and formal as like, for example, music theory or something like that. And the question I think I'm asking with this book is like, if we wanted to develop something called software design theory, how far could we take that? Like, at one end of the spectrum is just people arguing about I like this versus I like this, and nobody really has any reason to be believed over somebody else. You don't have any reason to buy somebody's ideas over somebody else's ideas except personal preference. And then at the other end of the spectrum is formal theory with like really specific, precise explanations and arguments that all like interlock in a very specific way that makes it about as close to objective truth as you can get with an art. Anyway, that's the idea that I'm thinking about.
That's interesting. I mean, I feel like there's decades and decades of uh, different opinions on different theories, software development theories out there. Like any of these famous books, be it Design Patterns,
Code.
Solid, uh, Mythical Man Month, you know.
Yeah, although I feel like there's a lot that's lacking from a lot of those. Like, okay, so there's theory and then there's like folk wisdom, and the two aren't incompatible. And often like folk wisdom is kind of a shorthand for a piece of well-established theory. Um, but a lot of this stuff is like we have the folk wisdom, but either the theory doesn't exist or nobody remembers it anymore. Like the solid principles, those have almost become okay, so not all five of those principles are of equal value, I think, but some of it has become kind of like superstition. It's like what are the five solid principles has become like a job interview question, which kind of implies that they are a truth that people should know. Whereas it's like, I'm not so sure that all five of those are actually true. And also, what's the theory behind them? I'm not sure that that's actually been articulated to like completeness.
Yeah, definitely haven't thought that deeply about it, but I see where you're going. It'd be interesting to delve into those things for
Yeah, so
sure.
like the single responsibility principle, I think is a really interesting one. Um, I think basically, the folk wisdom version of that is like every object should have just one responsibility. It should have one reason to change. It's like,
My problem with that is you can always write what the responsibility is to make that true.
right. It's like what constitutes one responsibility?
Right.
Um, and I actually wrote a blog post on the single responsibility principle to make that clear. It's like, hey, what constitutes one responsibility is subjective. It's up to you to draw the line to create that boundary of what's inside the responsibility and what's outside. And I think that's an objective aspect of the single responsibility principle. It's objectively true that the scope of responsibility is subjective. And that's a super important aspect of the theory of SRP that like I've never heard discussed one single time in my entire life. So that's like the level of maturity we're at with a lot of this stuff.
Yeah, I hear you.
Yeah. Yeah, and then other things, it's interesting. Okay, so I think the solid principles are interesting. The open closed principle, I think, is the next one. Um, I read a little bit of the history of that one. It's like classes should be open for extension but closed for modification.
Right.
Um, I never really understood what the heck that's supposed to mean. And then I read that that guideline dates back to a time and a scenario where you're shipping desktop software, or just the nature of the scenario was that you were kind of committed to whatever you did first.
Yeah, change was like super expensive and took a lot of time to accomplish versus, the other extreme would be like a web app where you have it hosted somewhere that you could change things very quickly.
Yeah. Yeah, and so that one, it's like, why are we even talking about that one anymore? And it took me like a lot of digging to find that like historical tidbit. And it's like, why did that take so much digging? Like, people talk about solids so much. If if we're taking this piece of folk wisdom and propagating it so much, and people are expecting people to know it and stuff like that, the fact that the open closed principle doesn't apply to the way we develop software in these decades. Like, why doesn't that piece of information, why is that piece of information not packaged up with this whole thing?
I'm not sure, like, I think it's less important maybe now, but I think it's still, I feel like it's still a good principle. Uh, I do feel like when we talk about solid, you get a lot of people who have uh, had, their solid reaction YouTube videos, and they all seem to be very like emotions based or
Hmm.
not uh, not very scientific. Like it's just their opinion, about
Yeah.
whether they like this one or that one. And a lot of people do like pick it apart and say, well, yeah, this principle makes a lot of sense, or that one doesn't, or I don't
Or
really understand this one.
even worse, they form their opinion based on whether they like Bob Martin or not.
How could you not like Bob Marley?
Well, it's a really interesting phenomenon. Because Bob Martin has kind of gotten in trouble for saying some like not PC things. Like I
Mhm.
think he said some things that like genuinely were not good things to say. I don't remember the details or whatever. But it's like, say Bob Martin is like literally Adolf Hitler. Like, even if he says two plus two equals four, but he's Hitler, like, that doesn't mean two plus two is five, you know?
The Mein Kampf appendix on the solid principles.
Exactly. Yeah, but due
Yeah,
to
I hear you.
human
I hear
nature,
you.
people can't separate the source of the information from the content of the information, and so do these gymnastics to argue why 2 plus 2 is 5 and not 4 because they don't like the person who said it.
Yeah, you know, I've forgotten that there were those things in his past, and I don't know how long ago they were, but I just remember him like from the 90s and picking up his I can't remember, like something like object oriented something in C++ plus plus or something like that, where I think like a lot of those solid principles originated from
Hmm.
in his works. And just remember getting my mind blown on all that stuff, going, wow, okay, this makes, you know, back then made a lot of sense because it was the time that it was. I was shipping desktop applications, and there wasn't, you know, nearly as much guidance as there is today.
Mm-hmm. Um, yeah, so let's see. What's the takeaway from that? Open closed principle. Well, I think one thing that can be said with pretty high confidence is that it's muddy. Or at least it's a bit muddy to me. Um, and I don't know, like we can't expect there to be like one single software design Bible where every single truth is written in this giant 3,000 page book or something like that. So if a certain principle is muddy to me, what does that say about anything? I'm not so sure.
I think I've heard a lot of people along the lines of Bob Martin express the idea that, well, it's engineering. There's so many variables. You know, each of these things aren't meant to be absolutes. They're meant to be applied in a uh, as you see fit when in the situation that you're in, which then it's like uh, makes it even muddier, right?
Yeah, yeah. So like that's totally true, of course, but I think it's like a sloppy, lazy cop out to say that. Um, because it's like, okay, these principles are context dependent, but like what exactly are the factors that they depend on? And if such and such is the situation, how does that make a difference? And what do I do in that scenario? If that variable is this different way, why does that make a difference? And what do I do in that scenario? I
And
wrote
I
this.
think
Hmm.
design patterns comes the closest to expressing it in just the way you're putting it, although they can't cover like all the different variables.
Mm.
But they uh, there's guidance like when you write a pattern to include those kind of trade-off kind of thoughts in the pattern itself.
I think like a large part of like the complexity with this as well is just the sheer amount of people that would be touching like software application versus other engineering disciplines. Like you can design a bridge once, but you know, my legacy Rails app has lived for 12 years and had dozens of people on it. So
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point.
You mean dozens of people working on it?
for some parts of their lives, yeah, um,
More
it
fingers in the
Yeah,
survived.
pie.
Yeah. And it's
that's what we
just
got to
like,
solve, this problem of people having to program.
yeah, yeah.
Oops, that's somebody's going to do that pretty soon here, and then we'll all be out of a job.
Mm.
Anywho,
Um, one of my favorite examples to think about is the concept of duplication. Um, and for me, for a long time, I had a mistaken idea of what duplication even is. I thought it was multiple copies of the same code. It's not exactly it. It's multiple copies of the same behavior.
did you just write about this last few months? Because I feel like I just read something that expressed this exact idea.
It was longer ago than that, but I reshare it once in a while.
Yeah, probably came from you. Yeah, I agree with that. It's like the point isn't the point is more the idea of don't duplicate the idea of it, even though in some cases it looks exactly the same. But here it's you're the somehow relates back to that solid principle of, you know, giving something only one reason to change. If you shove these two things together, then this code starts to degenerate over time, I think, because it's going to start collecting if statements and case
Yeah.
statements or just be changed for one purpose, forgetting that it was also serving some other purpose.
Yeah, so this is an area where people get really confused. It's like, um, I want I want a beast of burden that will carry me around from one town to another town. So I'll get a horse. Um, and I want another animal that will take care of my rodent problem in my barn. So I'll get some cats. And it's like, oh, well, this is stupid to have these two separate animals. Let's breed the horse and cat and have this like horse cat hybrid, and I can ride it around and it can kill my rodents for me and stuff like that. That's like a stupid unification, you know? Um, and that is like the semi straw man that people are arguing against a lot when they like caution against premature deduplication or something like that. These cases where you unify things that shouldn't be unified. And then you get these rules like everything twice or the rule of three, where it's like you should tolerate two instances of duplication, but not three. But that really doesn't make sense. Um, the question is, okay, first of all, duplication isn't good or bad. It just has costs. Um, and that cost can be greater or smaller. And what makes it more costly or more risky or less so? There's a few factors. One is how near to each other the instances of duplication are. If there's one line and then another line right after it, and theoretically you could unify those two things, but they're right next to each other, you're never going to miss that. And so if you change one and it's logically necessary for the other line to change also, that's like not a big deal because nobody's ever going to not notice. But if you have something in one file and then something really far away in some other file and it'll never occur to you to find it in the other place, then like that's way more dangerous. And so then it's much more called for to unify those two things. And there's a whole bunch of other aspects to duplication like that, where it's like it's a nuance and it's context dependent, but it's an explainable nuance. And there are like rational principles behind it. And there's no reason why we can't articulate these things. We don't have to just say, like, okay, duplication is bad in general, but like, just be careful. Don't go overboard. Good luck. That's like too vague.
Maybe about 6 or 7 years ago, working at Yahoo, we had this big program for doing, not going to think of the right words for it, but basically anti-patterns. And we documented them. And like I think duplication was one of those things, but we made sure that we put in there uh, the what are the different factors, like you said, and what might make you choose to go one way versus the other. So it wasn't like, oh, duplication's an anti-pattern and therefore you deduplicate. It was, well, you might deduplicate, you know, if these factors suggest that you should, or maybe you don't, and because of these other factors. And unfortunately, it's a work product, so I can't really share it, but we document a lot of different things like that, both in a general sense, and then, a company the size of that company had a lot of different languages, so we did language specific ones as well.
Okay.
It was pretty interesting exercise. But I think the point being is that we didn't try to give like prescriptive or overly prescriptive, or however you want to say it, things. We just said, here are the factors, make your own
Yeah.
decision. But
Yeah.
I think it's like, I think where you're going though seems to be like making that even more objective. Like, each of these factors, how you measure them. In some cases, like we didn't even try because that would be a whole, you know, investigation unto itself.
Hmm.
And so it just didn't seem worth the effort. But
Yeah. Yeah, and I want to be neitherly. I want to be neither overly prescriptive nor not prescriptive enough. I want to be just the right amount of prescriptive. Something I really hate. So I think there's a lot of cooking analogs here, but something that always drives me nuts is when recipes tell you to do something but don't explain why. Um, oh, I don't know, like you're making some pie dough and they tell you to cut up some butter into small cubes and then put it in the freezer for 15 minutes and mix the flour with the cold butter and some ice cold water. It's like, okay, great, like I'll do that and it works, but like why does all this stuff have to be so cold? You never explain that. And I think a lot of programming advice is like that. It's like no function should be longer than 10 lines or whatever. And it's like, okay, but like why exactly? It tells you the what, but not the why.
I think that'd be super interesting. I wonder how many people who grab that recipe on the internet care. You know what I mean? They just want the recipe that works.
That's a really interesting part of it because like a lot of programmers don't really care that much about this level of detail. Um, but like it really does matter. Um, and I think the target for this, maybe the average home cook doesn't care about like why make it cold, but like if you're trying to make like the world's best pie, then like absolutely you have to know why the ingredients need to be cold. And so if you're trying to be like a really, really, really good programmer, you have to understand stuff like what exactly is duplication, when is it more and less costly, that kind of thing.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I'm all in for the academic exercise of figuring these things out or taking them to the next level. I would say one thing is like I feel under underread or under researched for a lot of this stuff. I think that a lot of this research has already been done, I guess is what I mean to say.
Hmm. Okay, I have two reactions to that. One is maybe you didn't mean it quite like this, but I don't think it's academic. I think it's eminently practical. Um, and the other is I'm not so sure that much research and stuff is that necessary because a lot of the stuff you can think through from first principles or draw on personal experience, especially because a lot of the stuff is just, again, folk wisdom that's passed along verbally, and some of the stuff isn't really written down anywhere. And it's a matter merely of articulating the things that you've thought about a bunch of times, but never put into words.
So where would you start? Like, what would your book look like for this endeavor? Would it be a survey of these programming principles and sort of have a chapter for each principle, or maybe they get grouped into sets, who knows what? But and then you kind of take a deep dive, more of a explore the history and objective studies that have been done.
Yeah, it's a
Sorry.
good question. I'm still figuring that out. Um, I think the first thing that I want to do is sell the reader on the idea of theory. Explain what exactly I mean by theory and
Mhm.
sell the reader on it. Like, why bother with theory? Um,
And
and
I think the thing when you talk about theory, it's almost like a loaded thing because there's really two definitions of theory. One is
okay.
the more colloquial one, which means something that doesn't have a lot of evidence for it, but that maybe people think is true. And the other one, which is the scientific one, which is almost the opposite in its meaning. It means that, so far as we know, this is the best thing we have to explain whatever thing the theory is about, and there's like evidence for it, and there's been experiments that prove the theory or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah, I would even add one more. So, people use the term theory colloquially as kind of a usage error. They really mean hypothesis.
Or
Um,
even less than that, right? It's like a lot of
yes.
people mean it derogatorily, right?
Oh.
That's just a theory.
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. So there's that, and then there's scientific theories, and then there's what I'm calling practical theories. Um, Maybe there's an established name that I don't know about. This is just the label I slapped on it. But like music theory or probability theory, computation theory, and the difference, as far as I can tell, is a scientific theory exists to provide a correct explanation of some aspect of reality, whereas a practical theory exists to serve some practical purpose. And it's usually like not something that's like naturally occurring. Like probability theory is a man-made concept, as opposed to like evolutionary theory is a description of a natural phenomenon. So as far as I can think, that's the difference between these two kinds of theories.
Say those two again.
A scientific theory is it exists to explain. I'll start over. A scientific theory exists to provide a correct explanation of some aspect of reality, and a practical theory exists to serve some practical purpose.
And I've heard the scientific one slightly differently. It's like
Mm.
basically it's like you said to correctly explain explanation of reality, whereas I heard it's like a prediction. It's like what is
Ah,
it's like how well does this theory predict whatever it's a theory of,
yeah.
like how fast the apple is going to hit you in the head.
Mm-hmm. Um, so this book I've been talking about a million times all over the place, The Beginning of Infinity by David Deutsch. He talks about that. And he talks about this philosophy called instrumentalism. Um, and under instrumentalism, theories exist only for predictive purposes. The theories are just instruments for prediction. And under instrumentalism, I'm not saying that this is what you were saying, but under instrumentalism, um, the theories don't actually tell us anything about reality. They just make predictions. David Deutsch's argument is that theories exist to provide explanations of reality. They also can predict things, of course. They should. Um, but that's not the heart of it. The heart of it is to provide an explanation about reality.
I see.
Um, I'm just glancing at my couple written pages here. Yeah, why should we bother with theory? I definitely expect that I'm not going to reach everybody with these ideas. It's probably going to be a minority. But I imagine that the people who are into this idea will be really into it. And I think it could be influential among those people for whatever that is worth. Um, okay, yeah, why bother with theory? My argument is because theory helps us create better work products. Um, like if a musician, if I'm like a beginner musician and I just sit down at the piano and start like noodling around, I'm not likely to write a very good song, I don't think. But if I know some music theory, like for example, what kinds of chord progressions sound good, like I have like a repertoire of chord
Hmm.
progressions, and kind of the moods that go along with those chord progressions. It's like, I don't know, when Elton John wrote Crocodile Rock, he used, I'm not sure what key it's in, but like C, A, F, G, is that chord progression. That's like kind of the 1950, it evokes that like 1950s um, sound, which is clearly what he was going for. You know, I remember when rock was young, blah blah blah.
Hmm.
Um, he was able take this to take this like mood he apparently had in his head and convey that feeling to the listener by using this you know, he drew on his repertoire of
Yeah, as a not really great musician myself, I feel like the great thing about music theory is it limits your choices. Uh, in deciding like what notes go into a song. And so if you're r trying to read the music and you know something about the key that it's in and the chord progression, makes reading the music a lot easier
mm,
because you can notice the patterns easier,
hmm
because those patterns they're probably going to be greatly constrained. And the music theory, I guess you could say, to stretch this even further, like it's predictive of like what makes a good song. Well, if I know that it's, in this a good song that's in the key of whatever is going to sound best if it has certain chord progressions and includes certain notes. And if I want it to sound, melancholy, I'll play it one way, or choose different chords or different notes
hmm
versus, beat. And so I think that kind of fits into that uh, definition of a theory about being predictive real well.
hmm yeah, and obviously music is subjective. Everybody has their own personal preferences. No two people have the exact same taste in music, but
Well,
that
but a
does
lot of people like, music that has three or four chords played in a
Mhm.
certain way, in a certain
right.
progression. And even though you're right, it is subjective. There's some level of objectiveness to it, I think.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think
Um,
that plays into some stuff you were saying earlier about,
mhm.
forget what it was you were talking about. Like part of it could be broken up into the objective part of it. And I think it was the
Yeah.
not, big things are harder to understand than small things is the
hmm
objective part.
Yeah. Yeah, and I want to I'm going to make a note to myself actually about I don't know, evidence versus explanations. I'm not sure exactly how to put it. Um, but something that David Deutsch talks about in a different book, The Fabric of Reality, is some some explanations can be disregarded out of hand, rejected out of hand because they are bad explanations. The example he gives is the proposition that eating a pound of grass cures the common cold. Um, that can be rejected because it doesn't have any explanation behind it. And so it
Hold
could be
on.
tested.
You just
Uh-huh.
said you just said that explanation. I'm not following the logic here. You said there's no explanation behind it. Is that the right word, or did you mean evidence?
I think I used the wrong word,
Okay.
wrong words. Um, so I'll say that theory has no explanation behind it.
Okay.
Like there's no explanation for how eating a pound of grass could cure the common cold. And so we don't even have to bother to test it because there's an infinite number of theories that we theoretically could test, but we don't even bother to because there's no good explanation behind them.
This is the problem with the word theory, is that scientifically speaking, I think you're wrong that what makes them a theory is that they've been tested.
Yeah, it's more of a
Right.
hypothesis, I think.
Yeah. So anyway, I just pointing out the word theory is a little bit a sticky wicket.
Yeah, I got to be careful with that. Um, so I think a lot of it's sad, but a lot of like I don't know, educated people, white collar professionals, that kind of person, they think of themselves as being scientifically literate, but they're totally not. Um, and they have these hangups about uh, data and evidence and stuff like that. But I don't think they have a complete understanding of where data and evidence come into the picture. Um, I think there's this very popular idea that the way you tell if something is true or not is whether there's data or evidence supporting it. And obviously that's true, but that's part of the picture, and there's nuances to that. A big part of it is the explanation.
Does
Um,
the data mean what you think it means?
yeah. And like some things, you don't need a weatherman to tell you what way the wind blows, which way the wind blows. Um, like small things are easier to understand than big things. It's like, well, where's the evidence for that? Where's the data behind that? It's like, okay, I guess somebody could theoretically do a study that like proves that, but that's a case where it's
Do we
like,
really
come
need to
on.
do that? No.
Yeah. I fear that that's overly sloppy thinking on my part, and that's maybe not really like
Well,
rigorous
it's
enough.
like, should everybody have to do that? Or can like one dude write a book about it and everybody says, oh yeah, that, right? I think that's what you're going for.
Sorry, I didn't follow.
Oh, in other words, I think you're right. Somebody, there should be evidence about it. Somebody should articulate that. My guess is actually that on that, there must be evidence out there for it. Whether it specifically applies to software or not might not be the point because I think that big things being harder to understand than small things is a thing that applies to many, many domains. And so somewhere there's a
Yeah.
study that would apply.
Yeah, that's a good point. It doesn't have to be empirical evidence specifically for function size, for example.
Yeah, I mean, this is like the, what is it, the 5 ± 2 uh, study that they based making 7-digit phone numbers on.
Right. Yeah,
So,
like people can remember like seven pieces of information in their short-term memory, but after that, it doesn't work anymore.
right.
Yeah. Um, yeah, okay, so regarding data and evidence and all that stuff, um, with programming, it's really interesting because every single project has all these variables, and you can never do enough controlling of the variables in order to make a proper study of like anything. And I've seen descriptions of studies where it's like projects that use automated testing succeed have a 30% higher success rate than projects that don't. And I'm like, I don't know. Like, okay, maybe that's like true, but like, don't you
Feels
have to
true.
like make more statements about it in order for it to be a really like meaningful claim?
Right. And at your point about the different variables, like what are these kind of projects? why didn't they have automated testing? Maybe there's a factor there that, made it costly to do automated testing.
Right. Yeah, and it's like I saw this thing. Yeah, I saw this thing on Circle CI. I thought it was a great example. It said like, did you know? Um, I forget what it was, but it was like teams that deliver daily have a 30% lower build time or something like that. But it's like which one causes the other? Like, couldn't
Right.
it
I was
just
going to
be,
say it's
Yeah.
like you can't deliver daily if your build time's too high.
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah, and it's like maybe it's just the case that like good teams do everything better. And so that's why those two things go together.
Right. And even like it may be not so obvious, but if your build time is 2 hours, well, how many times do you actually build going from developers' uh, hands to production? And if your build time is even 2 hours, is that fast enough to
Mm,
do daily releases?
hmm.
If
Right.
you have a big team, maybe you have a lot of conflicts once the code comes together on CI. And
Yeah.
so
So like the data and evidence aren't enough. There needs to be like more skeptical scrutiny applied, and like you have to be thoughtful with the information you have and think about what it means and stuff like that. I saw this really infuriating headline one time. It was like, want to be a billionaire? Practice meditation. And then it had an interview with a guy who happened to be a billionaire, and he like credited meditation for his success. And it's like that is not a causal relationship, and it's not something you can replicate.
sounds
So
like some egos are getting stroked there.
possibly. And so, if we can't go off of like if every project's different and there's all these variables that can't be controlled, like is it just hopeless? I don't think so because I think individual people can draw on their own personal experiences. This is like counterintuitive, but like I think individual uh experiences, individual anecdotes are actually more valuable than broad scale data because the data is almost junk because there's so many variables involved. Like we can almost just we have to throw it all out.
Yeah. And I wonder
But
sometimes if that's why this kind of systematic research hasn't been done very broadly, at least. Like I feel like the individual people take deep dives in certain segments,
mm,
like testing or whatever. But then you have the folks who are like, the Agile Manifesto kind of folks who meaning it in the terms that it was originally meant in, the
hmm.
spirit, that spirit, where it's like, teams should decide for themselves what's working for them and what's not, and always be reviewing themselves and changing what they do to suit their specific uh, set of variables. And even those variables for them may change over time, even on the same project, right? And so
Yeah.
what may have worked for them the start might not work for them in the middle or toward the end of the project.
Yeah. So when individuals use their memories of their experiences as information, um, they can mentally control for the variables. It's like, okay, I'm trying to think of like some sports analogy or something like that. Not a big sports guy. Um, oh, chess. I'd go to chess clubs sometimes. It's like, okay, I didn't play very strongly tonight, but also as I often do before chess club, because it's our night to do this. I stuffed myself with a bunch of Mexican food before we went to chess club, and it dulled my intellect, and so I played worse. I can control for that variable. It's not a great example, but like, you know, when you do a big study of a huge amount of people and projects and stuff like that, it's not practical to like go into every individual one and look at all the different factors. But when
Right.
you're thinking of your own personal experiences, you can be like, okay, it was like I had a bad day that day, or I was tired, or this project was PHP, this project was Ruby, this was a startup, this was a big company, blah blah blah.
Yeah.
Makes sense to me. I mean, it kind of seems like similar to how the Gang of Fours design patterns book came about. Like it was
Hmm.
just four guys, right?
Yeah. Yeah, but again, we have to be careful because it's not the case that anything goes. We have to have explanations. It's like, I don't know. I've been on projects that used automated testing and it was a disaster.
Mhm.
Um, but there were certain factors that made that be the case. And we have to have explanations for what exactly went wrong. And we have to know when there were like, we have to admit when we don't know. Like, we have to know the difference between when we can draw a conclusion from something and when we can't. So I'm not sure how much of this is going into the book because so much of it is like kind of meta stuff. Like it's not the programming principles themselves, it's how we think about the programming principles. But I think it might be like half and half, like half how to think about it and then half the fruits of that thought.
How would people use this book? In other words, is this just a book that's meant to be read and ingested, and then what? Is it a book like, for instance, maybe it's a book that is for a team who's having troubles and trying to figure out where their troubles are and trying to pick something to do differently, the next month or two or whatever, however they're working.
Yeah, that's a
Um,
really interesting question. Okay,
Because
so
I'm thinking back to the agile spirit here, and how they don't necessarily have this problem of all these variables to consider, because like what you mentioned, they just have their own project to be concerned with. And probably they're not looking at everything as a whole. They're probably looking at things in terms of, this piece of the project kind of sucks, and I wish I could improve it, or maybe testing sucks and I wish I could improve it, or we're having a problem here, production issues, and what can we do to catch those before they get to production, kind of thing. And so I think, like, I don't know, maybe there's a lot of pragmatic help out there already. I'm not sure. Seems
hmm,
like there is. It's just hard to have like one uh, place to go to assess, you know.
yeah. Yeah, that's an okay, so what exactly was the question you asked me? Like how would people use this book or something?
Yeah, exactly. Like, what do you want people to do with it? It's like, you've got this information. I think answering that, the reason why I asked it is that I think that'll help what it is you would include and how you would present it.
Yeah.
And
Um,
what it is you would include would be, uh, how detailed you might get, or are you staying at like principles and trying to give, like, the important thing to take away is the principle, but here's the evidence for it, in case somebody asks you when you say you want to try this on the project, or this is an important thing on when I do my code review, here's the
yeah.
reasons why.
Yeah, it's a little hard to answer off the top of my head because I think it would be very broadly applicable. Oh man. Okay, so there's a concept I'm making a note of because I want to include it. the concept of reach. Like some ideas have more reach than others do. Um, and by design, a lot of the ideas in this book would have very broad reach and a very broad
I was going to say, how
applicability.
does reach differ from breadth? Or what do you mean exactly by reach? Like who or the
Um,
the
well, for
domain,
example,
software domain?
Newton's laws of physics apply to everything in the universe. So
Do they?
that's an idea with very broad reach. Okay, they're not precisely correct, but
Okay.
to the
Yeah.
degree that they're correct, they apply to everything. They don't just apply on Earth. And so I don't know, for example, the idea that theory helps you create a better work product, that's an idea with very broad reach. You can apply that to programming or cooking or whatever you want.
Hmm.
So that's
Interesting.
one.
It almost gives it more of a business flair to it than
Hmm.
a software development flair, which may be a good uh, way to come at it.
Well, another thing that I'm thinking about regarding how people would use this book is like a lot of people feel vague pains and then they kind of grasp at straws to try to make those pains go away. It's like we have this vague pain that we can't keep our code organized. So
Hmm.
let's try service objects.
I see. See. So in other words, you don't need a solution. You need to understand what the problem is
That
first.
too.
Yeah,
Yeah, man, that's another idea. Um, getting the problem nailed down before you jump to a solution.
right.
Um, but let's say somebody entertains the idea of service objects as a way to address their problems. What this book would invite them to consider is what is a service object? Whatever the thing is that you're thinking of, ask what is it? And what's the explanation behind it? Like one of the claims that I've heard, and I'm not trying to make this rant about service objects specifically, but it's just such a ripe area. Um, One of the arguments I've heard is that service objects make your code easier to test. Um, it's like, okay, if that's true, then it's good, but what's the explanation behind why that's supposedly true? Um, I This book would invite people to ask questions like that. Because if they did,
Makes
they'd see
sense.
there's not an answer, there's not an explanation. It's kind of like eating a pound of grass to cure the common cold. There's not an explanation for why a service ob so like, service objects versus what I would just call an object. Why one versus the other. I don't want to have to, for all the bad ideas that are out there and for all the future bad ideas that might come our way, I don't want to have to make individual refutations of all these ideas in detail and start from scratch with every single one. I would rather come up with a philosophy for how to process any idea and get first sell people on that philosophy because that might be an easier win than getting them to change their mind about a concrete principle.
I see. I see. I see. Yeah,
Yeah.
and that's like its own value into itself, separate from then applying that to specific situations. And so that would be like the part one of your book, and
Yeah.
the other parts would be maybe practical applications of that philosophy.
Yeah. Yeah, and it'll be really interesting once I get into it because like naturally I think I'm right about everything. And so it might be really easy to blur the line between here's an objective explanation, an objectively good argument, and here this is just my pet idea that I think is good, but really I can't tell anybody else that they should do it. So yeah, James, if you are interested, or Stephen, anybody, if you want to do some proofreading, it'd be really interesting to hear somebody else scrutinize scrutinize those ideas.
Yeah. I feel like
Yeah,
it
that'd
would
be
be
great.
good for people to be able to better articulate like what they like about like programming versus, tautological like arguments between wet and dry functions or what have you.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree. Um, okay, we're a bit over time. Um, thank you, Stephen and James, for indulging me in this topic. I hope you found it interesting too.
I think this
Um,
would make a great topic for your conference if you had to
I was
have
thinking
an
about it.
extra one,
Hmm.
because I think I would love to hear certain people's input on this. Dave Thomas being probably the biggest one, but there's definitely other folks there. Any of your speakers, really, who I'd love to
Yeah.
hear their opinions.
Yeah. Maybe we could have a breakout session or I don't know, just get a circle together or and talk about this stuff. Anyway, thanks guys for joining me, and I'll see you next time.
Thanks.
See you in Vegas, guys.
See you.